In order to understand the Terran Empire, one must have a working knowledge of its history. Unfortunately, that can be a little bit confusing as we are only given bits and pieces of how the Terran Empire was formed, and the information is provided out of order and throughout various series. What we can piece together is that what would ultimately become the Terran Empire most likely had its genesis around the 1200s to 1500s. This is based off several different sources, including Phlox, who mentions that the books of Shakespeare were similar in both the Prime Universe as well as the Mirror one. It is significant as it places the history of the two nearly coinciding around the 1500s. Additionally, we know that Emperor Philippa Georgiou states that the ideals of the Prime Starfleet had been shed, quote-unquote, a millennia ago, which would place the changes at about the 1200s. And given that she wasn't being precise, it could be well within the margin of 800 years to 1,000. It is also possible that the Terran Dominion is either a successor to, or still, the Roman Empire. We know that dialogue utilized by the Terrans is similar to that of the Romans, including naming conventions like Caesar, as well as iconography on imperial ships, the Terran salute itself, and Philippa Georgiou's full title being Philippa Georgiou Augustus Lepinius Centaurus. All of this leads one to believe that there are some roots from the once great empire. But regardless of its genesis, as the Terran Empire continued to dominate the world, ultimately becoming a one-world power even before the United Earth would, Mirror Universe Zephram Cochrane would create warp drive and be visited by the Vulcans, like we see in the Prime Universe. Though many believe this was a prelude to invasion by the Vulcans themselves. Zephram and his compatriots killed the captain and the first officer, boarded the ship, and began to use the technology to advance Terran interests. This jump-started the Terran Dominion space program and led to the creation of the Imperial Starfleet. This Starfleet would expand throughout the sector, galaxy, and indeed universe. When the Terran ships of war came upon a species, they would quickly move to subjugate them. By the 2150s, the Empire conquered the Vulcans, Andorians, Ainars, Orions, Tellarites, and Denobulans. They would also be engaged in either outright war or quasi-wars with the Klingons, Xindis, and Rigelians. The 22nd century was an interesting time for the Terran Empire. Like the Klingon Empire of the Prime Universe, it appears that the Imperial peoples would defeat a nation to then make them subjects and enlist them in the Imperial war machine. We can see this in 2155 as Andorians, Vulcans, and other species would be working aboard Terran ships. Ironically, this would make those ships more diverse than that of the Prime Universe equivalents, even if it was for more nefarious means. At what would be a growing theme for the Empire, the humans expand far too quickly and attempt to conquer far too much in the 22nd century. The various border wars combined with an internal rebellion of formerly conquered species nearly brings the Terran Empire to the brink of total destruction. Fortunately for the Empire, Captain or Admiral or something, Jonathan Archer, discovers a 23rd century Constitution-class ship, aptly named the Defiant, and utilizes it to put down the insurgents. After a failed attempt by alien crew members to destroy the Defiant, Archer would be poisoned and Hoshi Sato would deliver the Defiant to Earth, declaring herself Empress. We can't be sure to the extent the Defiant played a role, but we can logically surmise that it did invigorate the Terran Empire's technology, given the advancements we see in the 22nd and 23rd centuries. This would be reflected in the early 23rd century when the Empire had conquered, or destroyed, most all enemies to the Terrans within that time frame. The height of the Terrans' technological prowess would be with the invention of the ISS Charon, which was a palace as much as it was a ship. Unfortunately, due to a coup by a Terran captain named Lorca, the vessel would be destroyed with presumably both Lorca and Georgiou on board, leaving an immense power vacuum. We can't be sure how this vacuum was filled or if it caused any more civil strife, but by 2264 we know that the ISS Enterprise, under the command of James T. Kirk, would be the pride of the fleet and would be utilized to suppress rebellions. Seemingly, the Empire would have bounced back and was still in full control. The ISS Enterprise encountered a transporter accident where Kirk from the Prime Universe would be brought over. After his interactions with the Mirror Universe Spock, Kirk would return to his universe and ultimately Mirror Universe Spock would rise to power. The Vulcan would cause massive reforms which would be loved by most all within the Terran Empire itself. But unfortunately, these reforms would mean a dismantling of the Imperial Starfleet, which resulted in an attack by a Klingon-Cardassian alliance. This alliance would be successful and the subjugation of the Terrans and destruction of the Terran Empire would be all but inevitable. The culture of the Terran Empire was often a mixed bag. While the Empire largely suppressed cultures that were not human, they had periods in time where they did seem to either let those people work with them or treated them like semi-equals. In the 22nd century, aliens were permitted to be a part of the crew. After the failed rebellion, though, this seemed to be stopped in the early 23rd century, but reinstated mid to late 23rd century, possibly because of the loss of the palace ship and so many resources. During the early 23rd century, and likely most all of the Empire's growth, Starfleet officers would be known to eat aliens, including Kelpians and others. This was something that appeared commonplace and not questioned by the crew or others within the Empire. A lot of the Imperial Starfleet's culture was based on the ability to kill your superior or choose the side of whoever would win. This, of course, makes absolutely no sense, and even evil organizations couldn't survive under this structure. However, somehow, for 3 centuries, they made it work. The Terran symbol would often change, but the main staple of it included a sword piercing the Earth with either all of the continents or just the North American continent showing. At the height of its power, the Terran Empire would span across multiple territories, either conquering or destroying entire species. This included the Andorians, Betazoids, Denobulans, Orions, Tellarites, Vulcans, Bajorans, Hulkans, Gorlons, Kelpians, Klingons, and more. It is interesting, if not disheartening, to know that the thing that destroyed the Empire was a Vulcan reformist, but I'm sure there's a message in there somewhere. What are your thoughts? How do you feel about the Terran Empire? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next Lore Reloaded.